The Michigan Innocence Clinic is a clinic at the University of Michigan Law School dedicated to rectifying the wrongful convictions of Michigan prisoners where there is no biological evidence or DNA evidence to test. In 2009, we took the case of Dwayne Provience. Mr. Provience had been convicted in 2001 of a shooting he didn't commit. Mr. Provience's case raised several red flags for us from the get-go. First, he was convicted solely on the testimony of one witness who came forward 3 months after the shooting, a man named Larry Wiley, who was, by his own admission, a crack addict who offered his story implicating Mr. Provience only when he himself was in custody and wanted to get out. But Mr. Wiley's story was contradicted by 8 scene witnesses, one of whom was an off-duty police officer. Unfortunately for Mr. Provience, not a single one of those witnesses was called by his lawyer, a lawyer who was later disbarred.
This case stood out to us as a very probable wrongful conviction. And at the time we took it in March 2009, Larry Wiley was recanting. He'd signed an affidavit in 2006 admitting that he wasn't at the scene at all and made up his account. And he came in and spoke to our students here at the University of Michigan Law School and gave a videotaped interview in which he admitted that his testimony against the Proviences was completely false.
You testified at trial that you saw Dwayne Provience and Dale Provience in a beige-colored Regal. Was that true?
No.
Why did you testify that you saw them at Pembroke and Greenfield Avenue?
I was scared, and I was coached too.
Who coached you to?
I think his name was Sergeant Moore.
Is he a police officer?
Homicide 1300, second floor, I think.
Okay.
Can you explain a little more as to why you were scared or what made you?
Well, I didn't want to. Well, they had me for a B&E that I didn't commit, and they said if I testified, that they would help me out.
When you say that this police officer said he'd help you out,
right?
What do you mean by that? How did he help you?
He said he had dropped the charges on that B&E case. I didn't want to go to jail, you know, scared. I've been in prison 5 times already, so.
Was he good on his word?
I didn't go back to prison. He was good.
So we took this case to litigate new evidence, namely Larry Wiley's recantation of his inculpatory testimony against Dwayne Provience and ineffective assistance of counsel. But our students started to hit the streets of Northwest Detroit, the neighborhood in which Dwayne Provience and Renee Hunter and the others in the area lived. And every time they knocked on a door, every time they made a phone call, another piece of the puzzle began to fall into place.
During the investigation into our client's case, we found that when reviewing the file, I saw that the police had investigated a second murder at the same time, a related murder that occurred. When we looked into what happened during that investigation, we found out that the prosecutor had argued that the 2 murders were connected and that somebody else was responsible for both of them. So the prosecutors presented in court an entirely different theory of the case, different than the one that was used to convict our client 2 years earlier. In other words, the prosecutor's own account of the murder indicated that our client was innocent.
The second big break came when Maria spent a little more time digging into this alternative theory and was able to track down a set of progress notes made by the police at the time this Renee Hunter murder was actually investigated. And those progress notes spelled out for us in very plain language an alternate set of suspects who were responsible for Renee Hunter's murder. And those suspects had no connection at all to Dwayne Provience. At that point, we knew what we had to do was figure out who authored this report, and students began hitting the pavement to figure that out.
I was responsible for tracking down a number of the officers involved in this investigation. I talked to the 2 officers in charge of this homicide and a related homicide, and they didn't know who authored the reports. They hadn't seen the reports before. So what I did at that point was I ran a Google search for a name that I found in the police reports, an Officer Ashford. And I tracked Officer Ashford, simply went to a precinct and gave them a set of handwritten notes and said, essentially, please call me. And we got a call the next morning from an Officer Ashford who had written this police report.
I think a real clue that Officer Ashford held the key came during that phone call when he spoke to me on that Friday. He asked me who I represented, and I said Dwayne Provience, who'd been convicted of the murder of Renee Hunter. And Officer Ashford said, how on earth did that happen? And so faced with this mountain of new evidence and this mountain of evidence that had never been turned over to the defense, the prosecutor announced that they were giving in.
Well, there are two things that bother me with this case. One is obviously that an innocent man has been incarcerated for 9.5 years now. But the other thing that bothers me is the fact that the actual perpetrators of this crime and the people we know are the perpetrators based on the evidence the police compiled are free. Because that's a case where you allow guilty individuals to remain on the streets for a number of years. And not only guilty individuals, but individuals who are guilty of very serious crimes.
Dwayne Provience's case is a perfect example of why non-DNA innocence clinics are doing important work. People, when they think of wrongful convictions, think of DNA evidence showing who the right person was, who really did it. But in the great majority of felony cases, there is no biological evidence available to test for DNA. So you're not going to have that silver bullet to show that someone was wrongfully convicted. But the kinds of things that go wrong in cases where there is biological evidence to test go wrong in every other case just as frequently.
I believe if it wasn't for the innocent clinic, I wouldn't be free. I think I'd still be locked up. For a clinic like that to do 9 DNAs, it was never heard of for years. It wasn't never heard of. And for this to be in existence as of now, I believe doors is going to open. It's a lot of people who's innocent that is convicted cases dealing with 9 DNA, but they can't not get their foot in the door because most of the innocent clinics deal with DNA and they're not going to accept it. I don't care how point blank you explain to them and show them the evidence that you're innocent. Like in my case, they not going to accept it. And for the Michigan Innocence Clinic to come along at this point in time now to do cases that dealing with 9 DNA, I think is remarkable. That's something that Michigan been needing for a long time, and I believe other states need the same program as well.